My wife ran off with her ex on Thanksgiving Day. She left the house in her best dress, said she was going to pick up extra pie from the store, and never came back. 30 minutes later, I saw a text light up on her tablet that she'd forgotten on the counter. It was from him. "Glad you chose me. Let's drive until the world disappears." That was how 13 years of marriage ended, while the turkey was still warm on the table. My name is Daniel Price, 41 years old, construction foreman from Ohio. I've never been the type to shout or break things when life turns against me. I work with my hands. I build foundations. And when foundations crack, you don't scream at the concrete. You reinforce it piece by piece. That's how I live. That's how I survive. So I didn't chase after her. I didn't call or beg or ask why. I looked at that tablet, saw the trail of messages I'd been too blind to notice, and closed it. In the other room, the TV was still on, football blaring. Her stepfather, Raymond, sat slumped in his recliner with an oxygen tank beside him. His voice had grown weak over the last few months, eaten away by cancer. He had nowhere else to go, and now he had no one but me. Raymond was a complicated man. Stern, stubborn, with a stare that could cut through stone. My wife never had much love for him. She said he was cruel when she was a child, distant when she was a teenager. But he was dying now, and the responsibility of care had fallen to her. With her gone, it shifted silently onto my shoulders. I stood in the doorway and watched him struggle with the oxygen mask. He didn't look up, didn't ask where she was, didn't ask why I looked like my world had just been torn apart. Maybe he knew. Maybe he'd always known more than he let on. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, listening to the slow hiss of his breathing from the next room. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. I thought about calling her, thought about sending a message. But instead, I opened a fresh notebook. I wrote 3 words across the first page: freeze. Track. Respond. The next morning, Raymond spoke for the first time in weeks without being prompted. His voice was raspy but steady. He said there were things I didn't know about this family, things my wife had run from her whole life. He said secrets had been buried for decades, and if I was willing to stay, we could uncover them together. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, the man who had raised her, the man she despised, and realized something strange. My marriage had ended in silence, but maybe that silence was about to open the door to something far darker. Raymond's words lingered in the air longer than his breath. "There are things you don't know." He said it as if I'd already agreed to listen, as if I had no choice. Maybe I didn't. My wife was gone, my house was hollow, and the only sound inside it came from his oxygen machine. The silence left behind had to be filled with something, and now it was filling with secrets. The next morning, I went about my routine as if nothing had changed. I made coffee, scrambled eggs, laid out Raymond's medication, and kept my hands busy. That's what I've always done: work first, emotions later. He watched me carefully, those sharp eyes still alive even as his body failed. He didn't say much until I was about to leave for work. Then he said, "She hated me because I knew too much. And now you're the one left to carry it." At the job site, I tried to lose myself in the noise of drills and hammers, but the words kept circling back. Knew too much. Carry it. My wife had always avoided her stepfather, always cut conversations short, always looked for excuses to leave when he entered the room. I'd chalked it up to old resentment, maybe a broken relationship she never wanted to fix. But if what he hinted at was true, resentment wasn't the whole story. That evening, I returned home to find Raymond in his recliner, a folder on his lap. His hands trembled as he passed it to me. Inside were old photographs, brittle with age, and newspaper clippings yellowed with time. At first glance, they looked like ordinary family mementos. But then I saw the headlines. Local business fraud. Missing funds. Investigations quietly dropped. And a name I recognized, Raymond's. He said nothing while I flipped through the papers. Just watched me. When I looked up, he finally spoke. His voice was steady this time, stronger than I'd heard in months. She thought I was the villain. But villains don't bury truth to protect children. I didn't ask questions yet. That wasn't my way. I closed the folder, placed it on the table, and wrote a single note in my notebook: proof. Then I sat back in silence, letting him think I was undecided. In reality, I was already calculating. Freeze. Track. Respond. Later that night, alone in the kitchen, I turned the folder over again. The faces in the photos were familiar, my wife as a child, her mother younger, Raymond standing stiff beside them. But in the background of one picture was a man I didn't recognize, smiling with his arm draped casually around her mother. On the back of the photo, in faint handwriting, were the words, "Don't trust him." My wife had left me with nothing but betrayal. Her stepfather had left me with questions that carried the weight of decades. And now, for reasons I didn't yet understand, I was the only one positioned to uncover the truth. The next morning, I carried the folder with me to work. I didn't open it on the site, didn't let anyone see. But it was there in my truck, heavy as steel, reminding me that my wife's betrayal wasn't the only fracture in my life. Something older, darker, had been sitting beneath the surface of this family for years. At lunch, I sat alone, scanning the clippings one more time. Fraud investigations, missing money, and the man in the photo, the one with his arm around my wife's mother. His face gnawed at me. I couldn't place it, but something about the confidence in his smile looked familiar. When I flipped to the last page of the folder, I found an old receipt tucked between papers. A property deed. Small house outside Cleveland. Signed in his name. That night, I placed the deed on the kitchen table in front of Raymond. He studied it for a long time before speaking. His voice was gravelly, but the words came measured. He said the man's name was Charles Miller. A business partner once. A friend, briefly. Then an enemy. According to Raymond, Charles had been tied to every dark corner of his past. Money laundering, kickbacks, disappearing funds. And worse, he claimed Charles had manipulated his wife, my wife's mother, into keeping secrets from her own family. I listened quietly, pen in hand, taking notes. Not arguing. Not reacting. Just recording. When he finished, I asked the only question that mattered. Why show me this now? Raymond coughed, leaned back, and whispered that his daughter would never face the truth. She'd chosen to run rather than see it. But me, I was still here, and I had nothing left to lose. Later, after Raymond slept, I sat alone with the folder again. The handwriting on the back of the photograph haunted me. Don't trust him. Was it written by Raymond's wife? Or by someone else who had seen through Charles long ago? The more I studied, the more I realized this wasn't just a family feud. This was a buried history, one that connected betrayal, fraud, and maybe worse. I didn't call my wife. Didn't text her. Didn't tell her I knew more than she ever admitted. Instead, I opened my notebook and added a new line beneath proof. Charles Miller. I didn't know exactly what role he had played, but I knew the next step. Freeze. Track. Respond. And now it was time to start tracking. I started with the deed. The address was on the outskirts of Cleveland, a small property that looked unremarkable on paper. A single line of ink tying Charles Miller to something real. I drove out there on a Saturday morning, keeping my notebook on the passenger seat. The closer I got, the heavier the silence inside the truck became. The house was a one-story structure, weathered wood and peeling paint. It looked abandoned, but a newer lock glinted on the front door. Someone had been here recently. I didn't step onto the porch. Instead, I circled the property slowly, careful not to draw attention from neighbors. Through a cracked window, I saw boxes stacked against the far wall. Not trash. Records. I wrote it down. Boxes, records, signs of upkeep. Then I left. No confrontation. No breaking in. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for patterns. Back home, Raymond watched me closely when I told him where I'd been. His expression didn't change, but his breathing grew heavier. He said Charles never left things lying around unless he wanted someone to find them. He said if boxes were still in that house, then Charles wasn't done. He was still moving pieces in the dark. That night, I dug deeper. Public records, old property transfers, court filings buried online. Charles's name appeared and disappeared like smoke. Companies formed and dissolved. Properties bought and sold. Every time, money shifted hands without explanation. It wasn't just fraud. It was a network, a system built to hide truth in plain sight. As I traced the lines, something else surfaced. A payment trail leading back to my wife's mother. Small deposits, stretched over years, all tied to shell companies Charles had created. The implication was clear. She hadn't just been manipulated. She had been complicit. And that meant my wife had grown up inside a lie larger than she ever admitted. I sat in the dark kitchen, staring at the numbers, listening to the faint hiss of Raymond's oxygen machine from the next room. My wife had abandoned me to avoid her stepfather. But the truth was she had abandoned me to avoid her past. I opened my notebook again and wrote a new line. She knew. The pieces weren't fitting together yet, but they were circling the same center. Raymond, Charles, my wife's mother, all of them bound by secrets that had bled down through the years until I was sitting alone in a house filled with silence and lies. I didn't need to confront anyone yet. Confrontation comes at the end. For now, I only needed to watch, to listen, and to keep writing down the truth no one else wanted to face. And somewhere in the shadows, Charles Miller was still out there. The first step in pressure isn't noise, it's presence. So the next weekend, I drove back to the Cleveland property. This time, I didn't just circle. I parked across the street, sat in my truck with a thermos of coffee, and waited. Hours passed. The neighborhood shifted from quiet morning to restless afternoon. Then, just as the light began to fade, a black sedan pulled up. A man got out. He moved slowly, with the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching. Gray hair, sharp suit, but a stiffness in his shoulders. Even at a distance, I knew it was him, Charles Miller. He carried no boxes, no luggage, just a briefcase. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and the house swallowed him whole. I didn't follow. I didn't knock. I only watched. 45 minutes later, he emerged again, locked the door behind him, and drove away. His routine was clear. He was maintaining the property, which meant whatever was inside mattered. Back home, I told Raymond. His lips curled in something close to a smile, though his breathing was shallow. He said Charles never kept records where anyone could find them, unless he wanted to bait someone, which meant if the boxes were still there, they weren't just history. They were leverage. That night, I opened the folder again, tracing the lines between names and numbers. Every path led back to Charles. But one new detail emerged, a transfer of funds, dated just 6 months ago, into a trust account tied to my wife's name. Not her stepfather, not her mother, her. I stared at the screen for a long time, the silence pressing heavier than before. My wife had run off with her ex, but she hadn't run empty-handed. She had been receiving quiet payments, routed through Charles's network, long before Thanksgiving Day. That explained her sudden decision to leave. She hadn't abandoned me for love. She had abandoned me because she was already bought. I didn't tell Raymond that part. Not yet. I only wrote another note in my book. She's in it. The pieces were shifting faster now. Raymond's past, Charles's schemes, my wife's escape, they weren't separate fractures. They were the same fault line running through decades, finally breaking open in my hands. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, waiting, listening, knowing the silence around me wasn't just emptiness anymore. It was pressure building. And when pressure builds, something eventually has to break. I just had to decide where to strike first. The first strike was small, almost invisible. I made a copy of the property deed and mailed it anonymously to Charles's law office downtown. No note, no signature, just a reminder that someone had been looking at what he thought was buried. Men like Charles don't panic when threatened. They panic when reminded they're being watched. 2 days later, I drove past the Cleveland house again. The blinds that had been half open were now shut tight. The locks had been replaced, newer, heavier, and the boxes I had glimpsed through the cracked window were gone. Charles had moved them. My message had landed exactly where I wanted it to. That night, Raymond laughed for the first time in months. A hollow, rasping sound, but laughter all the same. He said Charles never reacted unless he felt cornered. He said this was proof the man was worried. His voice grew serious again when he added, "You need to keep pushing, but quietly." I nodded, though he could see the tension in my face. Because what I hadn't told him yet was what I found in the trust account. Payments tied directly to my wife. Proof she hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She had been complicit financially. Her running away wasn't escape. It was collection. I began my own quiet campaign. Public records became my battleground. I tracked shell companies, traced property lines, followed every digital breadcrumb that Charles had tried to scatter. With each document I copied, the network looked less like random corruption and more like a machine. A machine designed to bleed money through decades of silence. And then came the first real confirmation. A bank statement buried in county records, listing withdrawals that matched dates my wife had suddenly bought things we couldn't afford. Designer clothes, jewelry, trips she said were discounted. I realized now that every argument we'd had about money wasn't about overspending. It was about lies. I didn't call her, didn't confront her. Instead, I placed the bank statement on the same kitchen table where I kept the folder. Raymond stared at it for a long time, then looked at me with something between guilt and relief. He whispered that I finally understood why she ran. But I wasn't thinking about her anymore. I was thinking about Charles. Because if he was still moving records, still funneling money, still paying out through my wife, then the system wasn't past tense. It was active. And if it was active, then I had a chance to choke it at the source. I closed the notebook that night with a single line beneath all the others. Next move is mine. Charles moved first. It was a Tuesday night when I noticed the car. Parked across the street, engine off, two silhouettes inside. They didn't move, didn't knock, didn't call. Just sat there for hours, the way men sit when they're told to watch. When I stepped onto the porch, the engine started and the headlights cut through the dark before pulling away. I didn't follow. I just wrote down the time, the model, the plates. Quiet details. Evidence, not confrontation. The next morning, Raymond asked if I'd seen anything unusual. His voice was weaker now, but his eyes were sharp, hungry for information. I told him what I saw. He nodded once, the way a soldier does when he already knows the answer. He said Charles had always used watchers. Men who did nothing but remind you he could reach you whenever he wanted. It wasn't about attack. It was about pressure. That afternoon, I pushed back. I mailed another copy of the bank statement, the one tying funds to my wife's trust, to a journalist who had once written about local corruption. No name attached, no return address. Just fuel added to a fire that was already smoldering. By Thursday, I could see the effect. Charles's black sedan wasn't at the Cleveland house anymore. Instead, the blinds were torn down, the boxes gone, the locks broken again. Someone had cleared it in a hurry, not with patience, but with fear. He was running out of safe places to hide. Meanwhile, the silence inside my home grew heavier. Raymond's health declined, his breathing more ragged, his voice a whisper. But his words cut sharp. He told me Charles would never forgive exposure. That once whispers turned into questions, he would look for someone to bury the blame under. And now, with my wife gone, I was the closest target. I didn't argue. I simply wrote a new word in my notebook, shield. Because Raymond was right. Charles would push back harder now. He'd try to protect his empire by crushing the man he thought was weakest. But what he didn't understand was that weakness isn't silence. Silence is preparation. That night, I sat in the dark kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from me where my wife used to sit. Her betrayal had felt like the worst wound I'd ever endure. But now I understood, it had only cleared the field. She had left me behind, and in doing so, she had left me free. Charles had watchers. He had money. He had influence. But I had something he couldn't fight. Patience sharpened into strategy. And I was ready to strike back. The strike came on a Friday morning, quiet and deliberate. I took the folder of documents, the photographs, the receipts, and I made a copy of everything. Then I sent it, sealed, anonymous, to a federal office that handled financial crimes. Not to the police. Not to local authorities. Charles's reach went too deep for that. I wanted it where he couldn't silence it with a phone call. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. That same afternoon, I drove past the Cleveland house one last time. The place was gutted. Windows boarded, mailbox ripped off, grass left uncut. Charles had abandoned it, which told me one thing. He knew the walls were closing in. He wasn't cleaning up anymore. He was running. Back home, I found Raymond awake in his recliner, eyes sharper than I'd seen in weeks. I told him what I'd done. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't speak. But I saw something in his face, a release, like a man who had carried a weight for decades and finally set it down. The silence between us stretched, broken only by the hiss of his oxygen tank. Then he whispered something I'll never forget. He said, "Now you'll see what he really is when he's cornered." That night, the watchers returned. Not across the street this time, but closer, idling at the curb with headlights pointed at my window. They didn't get out. They didn't knock. They just sat there, a reminder that Charles had felt the strike. A message that exposure had consequences. I didn't react. I didn't step outside. I simply turned off the lights and let the house sink into darkness. In my notebook, I wrote one line. He knows. The following morning, Raymond's condition worsened. His breathing shallow, his voice almost gone. But before sleep pulled him under, he managed one more warning. He said Charles would not stop at intimidation. He said Charles's empire was built on silencing anyone who threatened it. And now, with me holding the proof, I had become the loudest silence he couldn't ignore. I stayed awake all night, waiting in the dark, listening for footsteps, for doors, for glass breaking. Nothing came. Just the steady hum of quiet war, pressure pressing in from every side. Charles had money. He had men. But I had already placed the truth where he couldn't touch it. And soon, silence wouldn't just surround him. It would consume him. The direct move came on a Monday evening. I was carrying groceries up the porch steps when I noticed the envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, written in thick black ink. Inside was a single photograph, me, standing outside the Cleveland house with my notebook in hand. Underneath, in block letters, were the words, "Stop." I didn't show it to Raymond. His body was too weak, but his mind too sharp. He'd know exactly what it meant, and I didn't want his last days poisoned by fear. Instead, I slipped the photo into my folder and wrote another word in my notebook, confirmed. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, waiting, every creak of the house pulling my attention. Nothing happened. And that silence, stretched across the hours, told me something more dangerous than a broken window or a forced door. Charles wasn't trying to scare me anymore. He was warning me before something final. The following morning, Raymond stirred. His voice was faint, but he managed to tell me he had something left to give. From beneath his chair cushion, he pulled out a small key. He whispered it opened a locker downtown. He'd kept it hidden for years, waiting for the moment when truth would matter more than survival. I took the key that afternoon, driving into the city with steady hands and a quiet mind. The locker was old, its metal scarred and rusted, but inside I found a thin binder. Pages of ledgers, signatures, dates. Proof Charles had moved money not just through companies, but through people, politicians, judges, even names I recognized from law enforcement. It wasn't fraud anymore. It was conspiracy. I drove home with the binder beside me, the weight of it pressing against the passenger seat like another living thing. When I showed it to Raymond, his hand shook as he touched the cover. He whispered that this was the part Charles would kill to keep buried. That evening, I noticed the car again outside my house. Not two men this time. One, sitting alone, staring at the windows. He didn't leave when I turned on the porch light. He didn't flinch when I stepped outside. He just sat there, the engine idling, until midnight. Then he drove away. I went back inside and placed the binder on the table beside the envelope and the photograph. The game wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about who would act first. Charles had shown me his warning. I was ready to show him my silence. The end didn't come with shouting or broken glass. It came with silence, the kind that follows when pressure has built too long to hold. 3 days after I opened Raymond's locker, federal agents raided a downtown office registered under one of Charles's shell companies. I didn't read about it in the paper first. I heard it in the stillness of the neighborhood. The car that had been idling outside my house vanished. The watchers were gone. And for the first time in weeks, the air around me felt lighter. That evening, I sat with Raymond in the dim glow of the living room lamp. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were clear. I placed the binder on his lap and told him it was over. He closed his eyes, leaned back, and whispered that the truth had finally found its way out. He didn't need details. He didn't need confirmation. He just needed to know that Charles's shadow no longer covered his family. 2 days later, Raymond passed in his sleep. Quiet. No struggle. Just gone. The house felt heavier without the hiss of his oxygen tank, but I didn't let grief pull me under. Instead, I returned to the notebook on my kitchen table. Every line I had written, freeze, track, respond, had carried me to this moment. I turned to the last page and wrote a final word, finished. The news broke a week later. Reports of a financial empire dismantled, of politicians scrambling to distance themselves, of investigations spanning multiple states. Charles Miller's name was everywhere now, tied to the corruption he had built for decades. His photo, gray hair, sharp suit, the same smile I had seen in that old picture, was plastered across screens. But there was no smile left in his eyes. I never saw my wife again. Rumor had it she tried to reach out when the money stopped flowing, when the ex she had run to realized she had nothing left to offer. I never answered. Some endings don't need closure. They need silence. I left the town soon after, packed what little I cared about, left the house behind, and drove west. I didn't take the binder. I didn't need it anymore. The truth was no longer mine to carry. It was in the system now, where men like Charles couldn't smother it. On the last night before I left, I sat alone on the porch, listening to the quiet. Thanksgiving had taken my wife. Silence had given me something else, the strength to watch, to wait, and to end a legacy of lies without raising my voice. Some men fight with noise. I fought with silence. And silence won. What would you have done in my place? If the story hit you, leave a like. And don't forget to subscribe. It only gets stronger from here.